The wind moves first, low and tireless, sweeping the buffalo grass until it shimmers like hammered tin beneath a high Montana sun. Far off, a blackbird lifts and scolds. The river braids through cottonwoods and willow, the water brown-green and secretive. If you stand still long enough, you can feel the ground hum with distant hoofbeats. Ponies cropping, children laughing, the thud of stakes driven for 100 lodges and then 100 more. This is the greasy grass, as the Lakota and Cheyenne call it. Dew slicks the blades until moccasins and horses come away darkened and shining. The name clings to the land, and it will cling to a memory that never fades. The making of this moment begins years earlier, when a lode of yellow metal glitters in the Black Hills and sets off a stampede as relentless as winter. Prospectors swarm where treaties had promised quiet. In Washington, patience thins into policy. The government demands that all non-reservation Lakota and Northern Cheyenne come to the agencies by January 30, 1876, or be considered hostile. It is a deadline issued like a sentence, carried by couriers across a landscape already locked in snow. Many never hear it, others refuse it. When the day passes, bluecoats saddle and ride. The frontier narrows to a single hard choice: yield or resist. Against that tightening noose stands a figure who seldom speaks to strangers, who rides a dun pony and wears his hair loose, who seeks power not in speeches, but in the silence before a charge. His name to his people is Tashunke Witko, Crazy Horse, Oglala Lakota war leader, wary as a wolf and precise as a flint blade. For years he has harried forts and cut thin the columns that move like iron snakes over the plains. He is not a chief of councils. He is a chief of mornings when the frost cracks and a rider points with a chin and says, "There." By the early summer of 1876, when the sun burns white at noon and the grasshoppers clatter, Crazy Horse rides at the head of a tide of warriors unwilling to be fenced in. On the high country east of the Little Bighorn, a different figure, older, heavier in the saddle, tightens his jaw against a gale that never seems to die. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, once a thunderbolt of the Civil War, now wears the long hair and buckskin of a prairie fighter. He's running lean, a regiment spread thin over a vast puzzle of ridges, coulees, and broken bluffs that hem the river like the teeth of a saw. The land itself conspires to mislead a man, turning sound to echo and distance to mirage. Somewhere below, in that labyrinth of water and willow, lies an encampment larger than any the scouts have seen. More than a village, it is a nation waiting in the grass. And before the steel strikes flint, there is a vision. During the great sun dance of that June, Sitting Bull, the hunk papa holy man, fasts until the sky tilts and falls into a trance. He tells of soldiers as thick as grasshoppers, tumbling upside down into a camp, their hats flying, a voice whispering that they have no ears. The people interpret it as a promise, not a boast, not a brag, but a cold note of fate. The soldiers will not hear, and so they will not live. Word of the vision moves like smoke from lodge to lodge. It finds young men oiling rifle bolts and grandmothers tying hair, and it sets their spines straight. If there is one place where the long arc of encroachment and resistance will touch fire, it is here. Along the lower bends of the Little Bighorn, the encampment stretches for miles. Lakota bands of Oglala, Hunkpapa, Miniconjou, Sanzark, and others. Northern Cheyenne, with Arapaho present as well. A sea of painted ponies, travois, and teepees. Children chase pups through sage. Men mend saddles. Women cut meat and speak of kin come in from Powder River. By some reckonings, the village holds roughly 7,000 to 8,000 souls, with 1,500 to 2,000 warriors able to ride. It is the largest gathering many elders can remember, the kind that comes only when a people mean to live according to their own laws, on their own ground. Yet this is not a people apart from the world so much as a world the United States has refused to see. The Treaty of 1868 once said one thing, gold said another. Settlers, rails, and survey lines nibble like mice through winter stores. And so the village on the greasy grass becomes both home and statement. To the army, it is a concentration of hostiles. To the people gathered here, it is safety in numbers and the renewal of a rhythm older than any fort. Hunt, feast, rest, move. The drums under the stars speak of continuity, and the ponies blow hot breath into the dark like small furnaces. Tomorrow is a hunt or a skirmish, or nothing at all. But the scouts on the ridges whisper of dust on the horizon and riders in column. The wind remembers other mornings when the bluecoats came. Crazy Horse is neither king nor saint. He is a man built for the hinged moments of a continent, the kind of leader who stands a little apart at council fires because he listens for different things, for a river changing tone, for a horse stiffening under him, for that instant when men either move together like a school of fish or scatter like leaves. When Crook pushes up the Rosebud on June 17th, he meets a storm of Lakota and Cheyenne led in part by Crazy Horse, and the long, bruising fight that follows. 6 hours of dust, shouting, and plunging horses forces Crook to turn back toward his supplies. What does this mean? That one of the 3 U.S. columns meant to hammer this encampment is suddenly absent on the day it matters most. Fate, like the prairie wind, is a conspirator you never see, and it has just tugged at one thread in the Army's plan. In the big camp, word of Rosebud arrives not in dispatches, but in laughing boys and a broadening diet. The meat comes in heavy, the songs run late. You can measure confidence in the way warriors paint their faces, more scarlet, more black, and in how often elders fall quiet to let the young men speak. A tide is rolling. Yet even here in the circles of victory talk, there is an awareness of what is coming. The Army does not bruise easy and go home. It doubles down. It brings more men, more mules, more certainty. The people concentrate along the Greasy Grass not because they want trouble, but because they want days like days used to be. Hunt, trade, courtship, the breeze on a hot noon, the river cold at ankle. The very ordinariness of life in that vast camp is what the soldiers will fail to understand. High on the bluffs to the east, Crow and Arikara scouts have already climbed to a place they call the Crow's Nest, scanning through heat shimmer at what first appears to be haze and then resolves into an enormous sprawl of lodges. The report they carry back is like tinder to Custer's instincts. A big village ripe for surprise. He believes in speed the way a gambler believes in a run of cards, convinced that violence delivered fast is mercy of a kind. He has been offered Gatling guns, heavier support, anchors he thinks will slow him, and he declines. Horses, men, and nerve. That is his trinity. He has seen smaller encampments break and scatter before the 7th. He has never seen this. Down in the willows, mothers hush babies and listen. The old men tend their pipes and read the river's glint. Somewhere, Sitting Bull's vision still hangs in the air like heat. Tomorrow, June 25th, 1876, the old ways and the new will collide hard enough to drive iron into bone. For the moment, though, all you hear is breath. Of ponies, of grass, of the river rolling around its gravel bars. The sun leans westward and throws long shadows from teepee poles across the damp meadows. If vengeance is coming, it is not a thirst for blood, but a demand to be left unbroken, to be measured truly, and to live where your name for the place makes more sense than the one stamped on a government map. The Greasy Grass will keep its own counsel until the hooves drum, and then the prairie will have to decide how long it remembers. Before the Greasy Grass became a storm, another wind shifted in a narrow valley to the south. On June 17th, General George Crook pushed up the Rosebud with infantry dusting the sage and cavalry stretched like a steel ribbon along the draws. He expected a brush, a runaway fight, the usual, a few mounted warriors melting into Badlands. Instead, the valley opened like a sprung trap. Lakota and Northern Cheyenne poured from the ridges, riders' hair streaming, rifles flashing in the hard light. At their head, Crazy Horse moved with the economy of someone who spends no gesture lightly. The battle sprawled over 6 hours. Charges, countercharges, men fighting from rocky knobs and willow-choked bends. The air so thick with dust, a man could taste grit between his teeth. Crook's line held, then wavered. Ammunition burned hot. Canteens ran out. Each time the soldiers tried to steady and push forward, the warriors slipped around their flanks like water around a stone. Late in the day, Crook chose the calculation that commanders come to when appetite and arithmetic collide. He withdrew toward his supplies. No bugles announced defeat. The valley simply emptied of blue. But the absence that followed was as loud as any trumpet. One prong of the great army pincer would not be there when the northern column needed it most. Word of Rosebud filtered into the big village by Little Bighorn. Not as a headline, but as a feeling, a rise in the chest like breath taken after a long dive. Women cut meat with brisker strokes. Boys spun stories while painting ponies, adding a stripe here, a handprint there. If Crook could be stopped, perhaps this summer might yet belong to old names and old trails. Still, the elders cautioned, the army is not one man. It is many men wearing one color. It will come again. Far to the east of the village, the Wolf Mountains shrugged off a cool night and exchanged it for a morning already vibrating with heat. In the darkness before dawn on June 25th, a knot of scouts climbed to a lookout the Crows called the Crow's Nest, a raw perch of stone with a hawk's command of the basins and coulees below. They peered through shimmering air at what first posed as ground fog and then refused to lift. The shape of it was wrong. The haze didn't move like weather. It pulsed and crawled. The scouts squinted and saw what a soldier might miss. The breath of many lodges, the dust of ponies, the long, sinuous scar of a village that ran for miles along the river. They came down fast to find Custer. Custer had ridden hard all spring, and the speed showed in the men and mounts. The 7th Cavalry was a living arithmetic problem. Companies broken into battalions, each slice of the regiment meant to cut the same cloth of victory from a fabric that kept changing under their hands. He had a plan in mind. Keep concealed in the folded land, wait a day, strike at dawn on June 26th when the light would make it easy to distinguish fleeing bands, and then, as always on the plains, a variable intruded. Some scouts swore they had been seen. Others spoke of dust plumes moving where no dust should be. The hardest thing in war is to tell the difference between caution and waste. To Custer, surprise was the single coin that could buy a quick triumph. If the village scattered, as villages usually did before a sudden blow, he might chase, gather, and deliver the victory General Terry awaited from the north. If it did not scatter, well, he did not put a name to the if. He declined the weight that might slow a blade, the little Gatling guns with their crank and promise, the extra foot drag of heavy support, horses, carbines, nerve. That had carried him before, and the measure of it seemed the same now as ever. As he rode, he repeated to officers the timetable that lived in his head. Find, fix, strike, and if possible, close the trap with Terry's and Gibbon's columns, pressing from the Bighorn. Out here, distances belong to the sky, and clocks are liars. By late morning, Custer elected to divide the regiment, once then again, trusting that a knife has more than one edge. He gave Major Marcus Reno 3 companies, A, G, and M, and pointed him straight down the valley. Drive at the south end of the camp and hit hard. He sent Captain Frederick Benteen with D, H, and K out to the left to pitch into anything that threatened the flank, a scouting thrust along a series of dry swales and sun-blasted ridges where a man could ride all day and still be in the same country. He kept 5 companies, C, E, F, I, and L, under his own hand, the striking fist. Captain Thomas McDougall, with Company B, guarded the pack train, mules and ammunition, the slow blood of any column. It was a plan that assumed the village would behave like other villages, that warriors would recoil from the shock of a skirmish line, that the path of least resistance would be the one men took when the world suddenly narrowed to the length of a carbine barrel. The Crow and Arikara scouts had their own reading of the day. The Crows rode because the Lakota and Cheyenne had pressed them for years out of old hunting grounds. The Arikara because enmities on the northern plains ran older than flags. They knew the difference between a small winter camp and a summer gathering. They had seen the sprawl, counted the pony herds in their fashion, and weighed the odds in a scale no army quartermaster would understand. Some cut their hair short in the old way of warriors who know the next fight might be their last. Others pulled off army blouses and put on shirts of trade cloth and buckskin, choosing to be themselves if the day came to die. Whether Custer listened fully or only enough is a debate the wind still hosts up there. What is certain is that he took the scouts' urgency and translated it into motion. Midday heat built over the breaks until the air trembled. The country ahead was treacherous in the way of all honest landscapes. It told you the truth and asked if you could hear it. Coulees ran like hidden knuckles under the grass, and the ridgelines created mirages of proximity. A village close enough to touch that nevertheless receded when a man tried to grab it. Reno's route into the valley would be straightforward in shape, and difficult, in fact. Benteen's path was the opposite, a series of oblique angles meant to guard against what might come from no one knew where. Custer would ride north along the higher ground, watching for a seam, any seam, between fear and boldness, where he could split the village wide, seize women and children as leverage, and unstring resistance the way a man slips beads from a broken cord. Such things had happened before, but never here, never with this many lodges, never with this much resolve pooled into one bend of the river. Orders ran down the lines in short, clipped sentences. A trooper tightened his cinch and muttered a prayer, learned from a mother who had never seen a buffalo. A mule in the pack train screamed and set others off, a chain of nervous brays that sounded like a cracked bell across the slope. The men carried single-shot Springfields heavy in the hand, accurate enough for a measured fight. Some had 7-shot revolvers riding their hips with the old promise of a 6-gun in a land that crushed promises for sport. The scouts carried their own hardware, repeaters, bows, and a lifetime's education in how men move when they mean to kill. South and west in the shimmering heat, the village lived its ordinary day with the alertness of people whose ordinary has included raids and alarms for a lifetime. Dogs barked, women laughed over some small joke beside a rack of drying meat, and children raced stick horses. Just at the moment when, miles away, Custer lifted his hand and the column checked. Then he sent a message that has outlived every grave it tried to save. A scrap of penciled paper addressed to Benteen. The letters pressed deep as if the point could tattoo urgency into the fibers. Benteen, come on, big village. Be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. The note rode with a courier who flogged his horse half to death, trying to compress distance into obedience. Behind him, the column uncoiled again. Reno, down in the lower land, would soon see what he had been sent to break. Benteen, off among sun-gnawed gullies, would weigh the command against the invisible enemy all officers fear, the terrain itself. McDougal with the mules would feel the truth that logistics is courage in another uniform. And Custer, tilting forward in the saddle the way a man leans into a gust, would fix his eyes on a thin blue thread of river and the pale dust above it. What happens next has been argued in barracks and basements for a century and a half, but at this precise instant the story still belongs to possibility. If the village scatters, the 7th might slash it into pieces and force a surrender by dusk. If it stands, if it surges, if those visions and griefs and iron-hard decisions cohere into a single motion, then the summer will have something to say that no officer's report can soften. The prairie holds its breath as the first files point downhill, and the greasy grass waits. Not passive, not eager, simply certain that what is about to happen will be remembered as long as grass can shine with dew. The valley opened to Major Marcus Reno like a dare. Heat lay on the grass in sheets. The river curled through cottonwood and willow, and somewhere beyond that green ribbon sprawled a camp so long it seemed to breathe with the earth. Reno had 3 companies and an order as blunt as a rifle stock. Move fast, strike the south end, unsettle the village, hold it in place for the blow to come. He trotted at first, then pushed the pace, dust fountaining from the hooves until the front rank rode inside its own yellow cloud. They passed a few lodges at the farthest fringe, shadows of life scattering toward the main camp, and men shouted in languages Reno did not know. What the major believed he was riding into, a shock, a panic, a sudden unraveling, did not arrive on schedule. Instead, the prairie answered him with motion. Warriors began as a handful of dark commas on the horizon and multiplied in the way of summer storms. They slipped from the riverbank and rose out of the sage, flags snapping on lances, hair streaming, faces painted for the narrow work of killing. Reno reined in to make a line of skirmishers, the drill book cure for cavalry surprised on open ground. Every 4th man holding horses while the others knelt or stood to fire. The order felt like a hinge turning in the wrong door. The lines stretched and thinned. Carbines cracked. Smoke walked along the barrels and hung in the heat. At first, the bluecoat fire made space, and men could taste that beginning of confidence which comes when the rhythm of shooting steadies the hands. Then the plain closed again as more riders poured from behind the river groves, turning the left and pricking at the right, creeping closer under the smoke. The skirmish line bled a little at the edges, and the little became a lot. Reno fell back into timber along the river. The kind of patchwork forest a man can turn into an ad hoc breastwork if he's quick, and the enemy obliges. Troopers found trunks in windfall, kicked at leaf mold to settle into crooks of shade, and shouted to each other through the powder haze. In there, the world shrank to 10 yards. A man fired, worked the trap door, cursed at a cartridge that stuck in a foul chamber, and fired again. Horses screamed unseen, tether ropes snapped, and somewhere along the bank the water hissed as a bullet's path unspooled flat across it. It should have been a place to catch breath and judge distance. Instead, the timber became a bell the warriors learned to ring. They pressed in with a patience that comes from knowing the ground, and knowing the men in front of you cannot stay still forever. Reno moved among his soldiers with that stiff economy commanders wear when they feel the pitch of a moment slipping. His face, already set, already pale beneath the dust, was suddenly freckled with something darker. It was blood and gray matter from bloody knife. An Arikara scout standing near him, whose head had been opened by a bullet at breast distance. The effect on the major was like a trapdoor giving way. The world tilted, order into disorder, resolve into a yell that sounded too much like panic. The order went down the line to mount and withdraw. Not a deliberate staged peel-off, but a dash, a bolt, the kind of movement men make when the air itself urges them to be elsewhere. Chaos is an animal with many legs. Horses jammed at the timber's edge. Troopers clambered onto saddles that seemed suddenly too tall, and the timber drank the last courtesy from the fight. The retreat turned into a wild run for the ford. The river, no longer a pretty braid but a brown wall with a silver laugh, took men up to their waists and then their chests. A horse stumbled and rolled, kicking. A carbine slipped beneath the surface. A hat spun like a leaf and was gone. The West Bank did not meet the water with a welcome. It reared in a cut bank that crumbled under iron and leather, sending horses backward, men clawing at roots that gave like old cloth. Warriors came hot to the bank, shooting from saddles or sliding down to finish a man in the churned shallows. A trooper who cleared the lip and found purchase turned back and reached for another, and in so doing felt hands on his own belt. And then all three went down together, tangled in reins and curses. On the near side of the crossing, the fight fractured into small, catastrophic theaters. A man with both hands in a horse's mane, trying to drag himself up as hooves chop the river. Another who loses his boot, and with it, the last idea of running fast. A third who sits down in 3 feet of water and laughs once, a bark at the sky, before scrambling to his feet as if he has surprised himself. The air filled with the sound of ponies blowing, the clatter of fallen carbines, the solemn universal prayer of men who want one more second. And over it all came the high, slicing ululations of women urging the warriors on. A human sound that lifted the hair on the neck and left no doubt that the village would not give the south end away simply because a stranger demanded it. Some of Reno's men found the notch of a ravine and drove their mounts at it, clawing up toward the bluffs. Others wheeled when they saw the slope, tried to rally where the grade eased, and then galloped again because the warriors were too close and the ground behind them felt inhabited by teeth. The climb to the high ground shook into the bodies of men and horses. Thighs burned, lungs caught fire, and the last stretch seemed to pull backward like a rope held at the other end by a giant with nothing better to do. At the top, the prairie leveled into a wind-scoured platform. No shade, little cover, but space enough to see a while in all directions. The survivors spilled across it, a scatter that hinted at the shape of a line without yet achieving one. Down below in the cottonwoods, a handful who had failed to catch the order to break. Men lost in the timber's green confusion, fought on in little knots until the press around them thinned, and each man at last chose a route out that was not a route at all, only a guess that led toward sky. Some made it to the bluffs by paths no surveyor would approve. Others went down in a quiet that arrived too swiftly to be called pain. A few Arikara scouts, knowing the country as if it were a relative, ghosted out along the folds and showed up later on the heights with faces carved into masks that kept counsel with themselves. Each arrival tightened the knot of men clinging to the crest. Up top, Reno's command, shocked, shrinking, and now dry-mouthed in the relentless sun, began to feel the arithmetic of thirst and ammunition. The packs were somewhere behind them, the regiment's other edges somewhere out of sight, and the sound carried on the wind was a confused braid. Distant volleys, individual shots, the occasional ring of a bugle that might have been an echo or a rumor. Officers shouted hoarse to reform companies, to align on nothing but instinct, to post pickets and send a handful to the lip of the bluff with orders to watch the river like men watch a fuse. The wounded tried to find a sliver of grass that felt like forgiveness, and a farrier tore strips from a saddle blanket that had only just cooled from the heat of a mule's back. The warriors did not come up in a single rush. They knew, too, the language of terrain and the economy of killing. They harried the flanks, sent a few good shots to test the spine of the crest, and then shifted to where a coulee offered a covered approach and a chance to sting without being stung. Bullets hummed and whickered, hit with that flat thud that speaks in any language, and the blue line pulled itself tighter, knees digging, elbows rooted, eyes as narrow as the slots between rocks. Some men fired at distances that would make a marksman sneer in peacetime. In war, a trigger squeeze can be a form of prayer, even when the shot means nothing to the physics of the day. A smear of dust to the south announced what every man on the ridge had been begging the horizon to deliver. It resolved into riders, company fronts sketched in heat shimmer, guidons jerking in a tired wind. Captain Frederick Benteen came in from the left with his 3 companies, not with the flourish of a parade savior, but with the grim, exacting competence of a man who knows that arrival is not rescue. It is the beginning of a different problem. Behind him, slower and stubborn as always, the pack train crept. The ammunition and water that meant the ridge could be something more than a pause before dying. Benteen took one long look into the valley, gauged the choke points and the likely places a man would try to put a bullet through another man, and then set about knitting the shattered into something like a defense. Reno's eyes, red-rimmed, jumpy, still shadowed by the death that had blown across his face in the timber, found the new anchor and held to it. Positions hardened along the bluff in a broken crescent, rifles trading punctuation with the ridges opposite. Men dug at the baked earth with knives and spoons and whatever else would scrape a shelter out of the sun. Water parties edged down the slope to the river. Volunteers, conscripts, men who drew the short straw, and men who did not need one. Each running the gauntlet of fire, each carrying back canteens that felt like small miracles, warmed to the temperature of blood. On the far side, smoke drifted where the village had been, and the sound that lifted from that direction was not panic, but a complex music of movement. Lodges struck and carried, pony herds pushed, warriors thrown from one fight to the next with the ease of people who had grown up with the idea that danger is only the name the uninitiated give to the ordinary. The siege had begun. It would last the rest of the day and into the next, a test not of bright charges, but of stubbornness and the modular virtues: aim, patience, silence when silence is survival. Men on the ridge learned the sight lines by heart, the way a gambler learns a rival's tells. They counted shots from the other side and decided when to answer and when to let the wind swallow a dare. Between the claps of gunfire, someone laughed too loudly at a joke nobody could hear. A bugler dozed upright and dreamed of shade. An NCO checked the lashings on a tourniquet as if neatness might yet discipline chaos. Nothing about the crest felt resolved. Somewhere to the north, beyond a broken back of country that made liars of maps, dust rose in thicker ropes, and the sound of fighting grew heavy, and then, impossibly, heavier. Men turned their faces in that direction as if listening harder could extend a hand. The ridge held, and holding, it took on the strange equality that comes in a fight neither side can yet afford to finish. Down in the river willows, dragonflies needled the air as if nothing had changed. Up where Reno and Benteen stood, everything had. The greasy grass, so green it seemed to belong to another kind of day, had become the color men remember when they talk about fear, and still the wind moved, indifferent as ever, combing the grass and lifting the powder smoke into threads that pointed north. North of Reno's dust, the country kinks and rises until it becomes a spine of broken ground, ribs, shoulders, and jutting knobs that hold the river at a wary distance. Custer brought 5 companies along that spine, riding as if he could feel the village's pulse through the reins. He angled down a long, dry swale that soldiers would later call Medicine Tail Coulee, and looked across to the middle of the encampment. Teepees like pale teeth, smoke lines printing the air, pony herds milling in the bottoms. For a moment, the plan seemed clean. A shock across the ford, a punch to the center, panic like dry grass catching. But the river there talked back. Warriors appeared in the willows and on the flats, first a handful, then dozens. Rifles bright, horses shouldering one another, the kind of sudden density that warns a man he has crossed an invisible boundary. Shots cracked from the brush, hissed across the shallows, thudded into wet sand, and Custer's forward feelers checked. Some native accounts later spoke of a leader shot near that ford. Others remembered only a hot, loud refusal that turned the soldiers away. Whatever the exact shape, the attempt at the water broke like a wave on stone, and the 5 companies pulled back up the coulee toward higher ground that looked safer until it wasn't. The prairie here makes its own decisions. Coulees run like trap lines hidden in grass. Ridges lift and twist so that a man who thinks he's on the crest finds himself on a tongue with flanks exposed. Custer's column stretched thin along this crooked country, probing for a seam in the village that did not exist. The warriors, now gathering in force, came on not as a single wall, but as a tide of separate crests. Lakota bands from the village center, Northern Cheyenne surging from the north, men who had fought at the Rosebud only days earlier and recognized the smell of a cavalry gambit that had run out of luck. Distant over Custer's shoulder, dust rose from Calhoun Hill where Company L began to form, and beyond it the backbone that soldiers would later name Battle Ridge ran like a flint blade to a knoll. Last Stand Hill in the language of defeat, just another swell of earth in the language of the land. On Calhoun's end of the ridge, the fight took its first terrible set. Skirmishers spread, horses were grabbed down, 1 man in 4 holding the reins while the others knelt to fire, and then the ground shifted under the tactic. The first bullets from the Cheyenne and Lakota came low and mean. They shot horses to pin the line to the dirt. They filtered through cuts and folds a man couldn't see until the muzzle flash convinced him he'd been looking the wrong way. Cartridges popped out of Springfield trap doors too hot to touch, and sometimes not at all, the soft copper sticking in swollen chambers. A knife or a carbine extractor banged on a case rim while a man swore and the next volley arrived without pity. The air scummed with dust and burned powder. Men breathed through cloth and still tasted copper in fear. Company by company, the 5-lettered islands tried to become a single shore and found that the current ran the other way. From the Lakota side, a hunkpapa named Red Horse would later draw the whole thing in the simple, awful grammar of ledger art. Blue soldiers dismounting, a skirmish line, then collapse, and finally encirclement like a lariat pulled tight. Northern Cheyenne voices, 2 Moons, Wooden Leg, Kate Bighead, spoke of soldiers riding back and forth along the heights, then dismounting and crowding together, then breaking into knots like dry clay. The feeling from those accounts is not of a theatrical stand, but of a faltering that accelerated once the ridge filled with warriors who knew every fold and hollow and moved as if the ground itself had taught them how. Down the ridge around the hump that soldiers later called Greasy Grass Ridge, a Cheyenne chief named Lame White Man rallied a cluster of fighters and pointed them up into the teeth of the line. "Come!" Witnesses remembered him shouting. "We can kill them all." He rode in the old way, close, fast, exposed, and fell in that same instant of courage. His death did not pause the charge, it fixed it. Cheyenne and Lakota pushed hard at Calhoun's position, where the fire stuttered and then spasmed and then failed, leaving only bodies, torn ground, and the hard, flat silence that gun smoke makes once it has spoken enough. The collapse at one end rippled through the rest. Between Calhoun Hill and the knoll to the north stretched a broken saddle of earth where companies E and F fought in overlapping pockets, and company held a rough center. The swirl here was granular, men taking fire from 2, sometimes 3 directions, horses shrilling as they went down, troopers clustering around flags because cloth on a stick feels like order when order is bleeding out of the day. Some tried to fall back by short rushes, covering each other in the textbook way. Others simply ran because reason arrived too late to be an antidote. Archaeology, long after a wildfire stripped the grass back to the bones of the hill, would map bright scatterings of cartridges across these lengths, the arcs and bunches that tell of a line that did not stand still, of positions taken and lost and taken again, of a ridge that fought as it retreated. Custer's personal orbit tightened to the knoll. With him gathered the last survivable circle, officers, trumpeters, a handful of enlisted men who had made it through the first crush. Around them, the ring of mounted warriors thickened until there was no direction that was not dangerous. Some Lakota later said a final small rush went in and finished it. Others swore the end came as a seepage, men falling where they stood until there was no more standing to be done. What we know is that when the firing slackened, 5 companies lay broken along the spine of the ridge. Among the dead were Custer's brothers, Tom and Boston, his brother-in-law, James Calhoun, his nephew, Henry Reed. The field made orphans of more than families. It orphaned a certainty that had carried the 7th too far into a kind of faith. There were no prisoners on that hill. The Lakota word traveled afterward like a plain statement of weather. Counting coup was done where it could be. The wounded were dispatched in ways that belonged to the blood-deep laws of the plains. War women came up, keening or singing or speaking softly as they moved among the bodies. Some struck the fallen, rage boiling out of the memory of stolen winters and dead children. Some took mementos. Others simply looked and then looked away. A few horses, bleeding, shaking, eyes rolled white, stood tethered to the end of exhaustion. One, later named Comanche, would be found so torn and pierced he should have died on any reasonable day, but did not, and he would become an emblem in far-off barracks of a survival the Army preferred to imagine as unique. At the foot of the knoll, a gully nicknamed Deep Ravine cut toward the river. Men went down into it in the final scramble and died there in a spill of bodies that later years would measure and argue over. Was there a last charge? Did a tight ring hold and go down almost where it first planted its boots? The ridge offers competing answers depending on where you stand and how long you listen. The simplest truth is that surrounded men try everything, and that the difference between a heroic stand and a running fight recorded at strobe light intervals is often only a historian's appetite. What the ground remembers, brass, bone, lead, suggests motion, rupture, and the route of hope. All the while, from the south, a separate narrative beat against this one like a second heart. On the Reno-Benteen Hills, the cartridges clicked and the canteens came back bloody from the river's edge. And every second man turned his head north as if a look could add one rifle to the circle on the knoll. The two fights shared a sky and a wind, but almost no sight lines, and so each invented the other in rumor. Bugles imagined where there were none. Triumph or disaster projected across broken country because a human mind cannot abide blankness. By the time the truth came stitched to the horizon in the boots of the relief column, the ridge to the north was finished speaking. When the last carbine fell silent on Custer's field, the sound it left behind was disconcertingly ordinary. Wind combing heat from the grass, a meadowlark throwing bright notes as if such things belonged to this hour. The slow proceedings of war after war's brief, bright business is done. Warriors move methodically now, protecting their own, seeing to the grim housekeeping fights require. The village, too, was in motion. Lodges being struck, pony herds pressed, families shifting up and out along the bends to avoid whatever counterblow the soldiers to the south might yet manage. Victory here did not arrive as a shout. It arrived as a widening of breath, as a release of a coil wound through years of treaty talk and broken promises, as the simple knowledge that for one full, sun-scoured day, the people had stood in their own doorway and said no. The cost of that no, past and to come, waited just beyond the last ridge in a country that looks harmless until it remembers what it can do. By late afternoon, the weight of the day slid south on the wind, but the ridge where Reno and Benteen clung did not relax. The light grew long and metallic, the kind that makes every edge look sharper and every mistake permanent. Men lay in shallow scrapes that pretended to be trenches, faces dust-caked, lips swollen with thirst. When the order went down for water, details moved like ghosts, stooping, gliding, canteens looped around their necks, each man rehearsing the sequence of run-fill-run until it crowded out fear. They came back with canteens warm as blood and counted themselves like gamblers back from a crooked table. Night finally draped the bluffs, and with it came the staccato quiet of a siege that refuses to sleep. A lone shot here, answering fire there. The whisper of men shifting their weight so slowly the ground might not notice. Dawn on June 26th arrived as a hard white fact. The warriors did not press in a single wave so much as needle the line with quick hands, testing, peeling back when answered, sliding to a new angle, stinging again. The ridge learned how to breathe between volleys. A man measured his world by three sounds: the whistle of a round that had his name on it and missed, the smack of one that didn't, and the dry rattle of his own cartridge as it seated right. All day the position held with the stubborn, unambitious courage of people who have stripped their to-do list to one line: endure. What the men on the heights could not see was the larger motion beyond their horizon. In the evening, the village, lodges, families, pony herds, lifted itself and flowed up the river bends, the way a flock will rise in unison and make of chaos a single shape. The people had won a battle so complete it required no sequel on that ground. To linger was to invite a kind of attention that never quits. By nightfall, the bluffs looked out over more emptiness than any defender had dared to imagine. Only then did the siege loosen its grip. A few shots cracked out of habit. The crickets recommenced the old arguments they had been having in the grass before soldiers arrived. Relief did not gallop over the skyline like a painting. It came in the measured tread of columns that had fought the country to a draw. The northward force under General Terry and Colonel Gibbon, picking its way onto Reno Hill on the 27th. Faces set, questions already forming that no one could answer without walking north. They did. They found the broken ridges and, on them, the cost. Men who had survived 2 days of thirst and shooting looked out across a field where 5 companies had been erased from the roster and felt that peculiarly military grief that has no theatrics, only a tightening in the throat and a quiet, practical anger. They noted the patterns even then: the clusters of bodies on the knoll, the long arc where horses had gone down, the scatter of brass that told a story anyone could read if he had ever loaded a gun more than once. Among the living there was one horse that should not have been. Riddled and stunned, a bay gelding, later called Comanche, stood with that rafter-taut, vibrating stillness of an animal that has been to the edge and decided, for reasons unknown to men, to step backward. He would become a symbol in far-off garrisons, a way for the army to say something wordless about endurance, though the truth was that many ponies survived on the other side. Tough, small, quick as gossip, and no marker would carry their names. Across the river and up the bends, the people took inventory of their victory. The living counted and the dead counted, grief taken up like a tool and used without apology. There were rituals for this, old as grass. Women keened. Men who had fought stood apart and let the sound pass through them. Coup was counted. Objects were taken that meant a life had been measured with another's. A few lodges would add black to their stories for kin who had fallen. Yet even in that morning, there was a deeper exhalation, a sense that the world had briefly snapped back into its rightful shape. Strangers who came with iron and paper had been met and turned. News outran ponies. By early July, the word reached a nation drunk on its centennial, its parades, its brass bands, its proofs of permanence. The last stand of a Civil War hero, the annihilation of his battalion, the indecency of defeat on a day meant for celebration. These become an acid when they mix. There were speeches, denunciations, tight-jawed vows. The great machinery of the Republic shifted gears and made a noise it had been designed to make. It would not accept this answer from the plains. Reinforcements poured west, forts swelled, contracts fattened. The buffalo herds, the continent's old wealth, were already dying of market logic and rifles. Now policy and winter would finish what greed had begun. The campaigns that followed were made of the unshowy verbs that wear enemies down. March, surround, starve, wait. Skirmishes flared all autumn, and then winter took command. Snow pressed lodge skins. Men woke to boots frozen in the shape of feet. Fires ate through what was left of patience. On January 8, 1877, high in the Wolf Mountains, Crazy Horse and his allies met soldiers under Nelson Miles, in a fight that was more a conversation with the weather than with the enemy. The cold erased the difference between bravery and stubbornness. It asked simply, how long can you stand here? The answer, for people carrying a whole nation on their backs, could not be forever. In May, as the prairie tipped into that sweet green that fools a man into optimism, Crazy Horse led his band to the Red Cloud Agency. He came not to bow a head, but to keep his people alive. Hunger is a negotiator no man can outtalk. He surrendered in the plain meaning of the word, and in another sense did not. There remained in him a refusal to be arranged comfortably inside someone else's idea. He would not be stared at by tourists. He would not perform his name for a ledger. He promised to go where the officers said, and then did not do it in the way they meant. That friction, the kind created when an unbending will is pushed into a narrow corridor, heated quickly. Rumor is a flame that finds grease everywhere. By late summer, misread orders, jealousies between agency scouts and followers, and an officer's short patience braided together into a rope that snagged him. On September 5, 1877, at Camp Robinson, Nebraska, soldiers moved to confine Crazy Horse in the guardhouse. What happened in those next heartbeats has been told too many ways to be certain of its exact shape. What is certain is the sound a bayonet makes when it enters a body and the way a strong man's legs turn to vines. He died that evening. His body passed into the keeping of those who loved him, and then into the earth in a place that has kept its secret. The land accepts certain men with the same quiet it uses on stones. What, then, did Greasy Grass buy? It bought a day of sovereignty paid for with decades of winter. It bought a chapter in a nation's book, written in a language the nation pretended not to read. It bought time for children to run between teepees, for songs to be sung the old way, for a vision to prove itself against the world. And it bought, too, a harsher tomorrow. Agencies tightened, promises shrank, and the net of dependency drew itself across a people who had spent centuries outrunning nets. The victory was real and complete on its own terms. The war that followed would be fought on terms designed to make victories irrelevant. Back east, the story began to harden into a shape that suited parlors and newspaper columns. Custer's Last Stand made a better headline than The Victory at Greasy Grass. Painters arranged the hill to flatter a myth of doomed gallantry. Biographers hunted for scapegoats in buckskin and on bureaus. Reno was tried by rumor long before the Army convened a court to inquire into his conduct. Benteen, who had saved what could be saved, returned to the endless trial men wage against their own second-guessing. Each told the story as he could live with it. Each found that memory is a witness who often prefers implication to confession. The people on the other side had their witnesses too. Red Horse drew what he had seen in ledger lines that do not flatter any man, only arrange him where he fell. Two Moons and Wooden Legs spoke in the even tones of those who do not need to dramatize, because the day has already done it for them. The names of women echo through those accounts in the precise, electric way women move through all real histories, urging, tending, mourning, deciding what must be carried and what must be left. No authenticated photograph of Crazy Horse exists. Perhaps that is why the pictures made by those who knew him, on paper, in words, in the way the wind says his name to the grass, feel honest. They do not pin him to a chair. They let him move. Years piled until the battlefield wore paths again. Tourists' feet walking where charges went in. Caretakers painting slender white markers on the slopes to show where a man's last minute ended. Granite grew on both sides, and flags learned to share a skyline. The little Bighorn National Cemetery laid its measured rows. Across the river, on the hills where Calhoun fell and where the last cluster died, the light still changes in the same old ways. Meadowlarks keep their appointment with the morning. The coolies hold their chill long after noon. If you stand at the right hour on the right day and tell yourself the truth, you can hear two stories at once, the Army's and the people's, braided by wind into something like a single rope. Call it vengeance if you must. To the Lakota and the Northern Cheyenne, it was not revenge in the petty register of a duel. It was a correction, a balancing. A voice long talked overrose and, for a day, spoke so loudly that even a nation celebrating itself had to listen. Yet vengeance always carries a cost written in invisible ink. For Crazy Horse, that cost was his life and the breaking of a season that might have turned another way. For his people, it was the long narrowing of choice. For the United States, it was a necessary lesson badly learned, that a treaty is an oath or it is kindling. Evening comes fast on those hills, the way it did before the first lodge ever crossed the river. The grass darkens, the river finds its silver again. The wind, that incessant historian, writes the same single sentence it has always written. Remember, names fade, myths ossify, Arguments cool and are reheated by each generation in its own sauce. But down at the level where hooves struck and breath burned, and a man looked at another man from 20 paces and made a choice, the day remains hot. The greasy grass remembers. The ash is still in it if you know how to look. History does not end on a hill. It goes to ground, then rises later in forms that suit the living. After the bodies were gathered and the cartridges lay mute in the sun, the story of the greasy grass began its slow migration from breath to paper to paint to granite. In that migration, facts rubbed against feelings until sparks flew, and the sparks are with us still. What happened is one thing. What we choose to remember is another. On these bluffs, the two keep arguing every time the wind changes. Begin with the rifles, because men always do when the smoke clears. The 7th carried single-shot Springfield carbines, sturdy but temperamental when the chambers burned hot and the soft copper cases swelled. A trooper with blackened fingers could tell you how a stuck shell shaves a minute off your life. Many Lakota and Northern Cheyenne, by trade, capture, or long habit, fought with repeaters, Henrys, and Spencers that answered a single trigger squeeze with a quick chorus. Not all had them, but enough did to change the cadence of a fight on broken ground. And those Gatlings? Offered, declined. Would they have mattered? On this maze of coulee and ridge, dragged by mules already hard used, the crank guns might have traded speed for the illusion of safety. Custer put his coin on horses and nerve, as he always had. On June 25th, the House collected. Then there is the old quarrel over time and distance, those twin liars of the plains. The plan on paper, Terry and Gibbon coming from the north, Custer from the east, required a clock the country does not keep. The land folds sound, hides dust, eats hours. A regiment split once, then split again. Invited a truth the Lakota and Cheyenne knew as well as they knew the way a pony breathes. Men who cannot see each other clearly cannot fight like one animal. Reno's Valley fight, Benteen's leftward screen, the pack train's slow courage, Custer's probe at the ford, all of it made sense in the mouths of the officers who gave the orders. A different sense prevailed where the pony herds grazed. The people gathered in the bend of the river had not come to bargain with fragments. The scouts carry another story, braided from older feuds and newer bargains. Crow riders guided Custer along the heights because the Lakota and Cheyenne had been pressing them out of hunting grounds for years. Arikara scouts fought beside the 7th for reasons the blue-coated paymaster would never fully count. Mitch Boyer rode between worlds until the ridge wrote his name in dust. Giovanni Martino, John Martin, carried that penciled plea to Benteen through a country that swallows messages as easily as men. Their presence reminds us that the frontier was never simply blue versus buckskin. It was a tangle of old debts and fresh griefs, each man's horizon curved by a different history. Memory's first great scaffolding went up in 1879 when the Army convened the Reno Court of Inquiry. Testimony piled upon testimony until the record sagged. But the thing a court can never try is the weather of a man's heart. Panic in timber, courage on a ridge, a judgment call made while a friend's blood freckles your face. No transcript can hold that steady. Later, painters took a turn. Custer's last stand turned the day into a single image. A bright ring of doomed gallantry, the flags lifted, the 6 guns raised in heroic silhouette. It looked good above a mantle. It told a tidy lie. The true shape was more granular, lines forming and bending. Horses falling first to pin men down, 100 small local endings converging into one silence. Ledger art by Red Horse and others corrected the palette. Flat figures, yes, but flat in the honest way. Unadorned, witnessed, placed where the eye saw them fall. The ground itself kept an account in brass and lead and bone. Long after the last cavalry boot left the ridge, lightning set a fire that burned the grass to its old scars, and archaeologists walked the hills with sifting screens and measured tape. What they found matched what the old stories had said. Clusters where companies tried to hold and then bled away. Arcs of spent shells that traced short, frantic rushes. Native cartridge scatter converging like fingers, closing into a fist along Greasy Grass Ridge. In Deep Ravine, they found the stubborn riddle of numbers and placements that still invites argument among the mapmakers of memory. But even arguments can be a kind of reverence when they begin with a man kneeling to read the earth. Out in the great echo chamber beyond the bluffs, the nation made a myth it could live with. The word vengeance hung in the air like a burr, sticking to every retelling. Whose vengeance? Crazy Horse's, yes, and Gauls, whose family died under Reno's first volleys. In the people's, long cheated by winter hunger and treaty paper that dissolved like snow in a warm hand. But if you listen longer, you hear another register. Not vengeance as personal vendetta, but as balance. An old law reasserting itself when a younger law grew loud. Sitting Bull's vision of soldiers tumbling like grasshoppers became more than omen. It was diagnosis. They have no ears, the vision said. No ears for other names on the same river, other histories in the same wind. After Greasy Grass, Winter became the Army's best lieutenant. Wolf Mountain measured Crazy Horse and found him human, which is to say susceptible to hunger, cold, and the grinding arithmetic of protecting the young before anything else. His surrender in May was a father's act as much as a war leader's, and his death in September, the guardhouse, the jostle, the bright sting of steel, was the kind of ending empires prefer. Unphotographed, confused, tidy for the report. No authenticated image of him remains. Perhaps that is why he never freezes into a single face. He stays motion, the tilt of a man's chin at the edge of a coulee, the angle of a bareback rider leaning into a rise, the quiet at the center of a charge. Names were argued over too, because names are the first frontier. Little Bighorn carries the Army's map. Greasy Grass belongs to the people who watch dew turn blades dark on their moccasins at dawn. Walk the cemetery below the bluffs, and the markers speak in the clipped sorrow diction of marble. Cross the road to the Indian Memorial, and the language flows different, voice after voice speaking in circles, braids, and kinship lines, making space for grief that is not punctual but seasonal. Between them, the river goes on saying nothing and everything, shouldering its way past willow and cottonwood, as if history were exactly what a river thinks it is. Turn, turn, carry, return. And what of Comanche? The bay gelding the Army would dress in trappings and mourn before gatherings of brass buttons and burnished words. He stands in the tale like a stubborn fact that wishes to be a parable. Yes, he endured. One horse among many that did. Yes, he became a banner for a battalion that needed one. But if you look north from his legend, you can see 1,000 small ponies on the far bank, tough as rawhide, sharp-eared, uncounted, riddled and still moving. The true engines of the day. Comanche's fame is not a falsehood so much as a narrowing. The battle resists narrowing. Reno and Benteen limped back into a world that greeted them with questions sharpened into accusations. A court pinned statements to boards like butterflies, and still the colors shifted. Benteen, the competent cynic, wrote his letters and fought the old fight against the man in the mirror. Reno respected orders and resented ghosts. In their accounts, as in all men's, the inexcusable and the inevitable never quite hold still long enough to be labeled. The Lakota and Cheyenne accounts require no such labels. They tell what they saw, add what it meant, and then stop where the land stops talking. If you stand on the ridge late and let the sun lower itself into the far breaks, you can hear the harmonica-thin song the prairie always sings. Coolies cool first, meadowlarks trade last notes. The river collects what the day has shed and carries it on. Look east, the faint gleam of markers, ranks measured by the geometry of death. Look west, the earthwork curve of the Indian Memorial, words cut through stone so that the sky is part of the grammar. Between them runs a footpath beaten by tourists and caretakers and children who race because children always do. The lawless frontier, it was never lawless to the people who named it Greasy Grass. Laws older than courthouses ruled here, of promise, of kinship, of reciprocity with the grass and the wind. On June 25th and 26th, 1876, those laws met a younger nation's certainty and did not step aside. What remains? Not certainty. That was buried on the ridge with 5 companies. What remains is a living argument that refuses to disgrace itself with finality. The cartridges say one thing, the oral histories braid back with another. The river writes a third and erases it by morning. Crazy Horse rides through all 3 like a shadow that falls sharp at noon and long at dusk. Never a portrait, always a motion. If the day demanded vengeance, it delivered something larger. a reckoning that still shakes loose the dust from our language about winners and losers, savages and heroes, destiny and its discontents. On this ground, the prairie does not pick sides. It picks memory. It insists we listen with ears that work.